Yeah, I think you may have mentioned this briefly last time too, right? About kind of the distributional sort of elements of this whole thing. So I didn't have a chance to read it all through though. So do you want to synopsize it for us? We may as well, we may as well talk about this.
After describing all the different ways that the mind can be extended, she interestingly puts these few paragraphs at the end of the book, which I hadn't noticed before, wherein she says, well, whether or not you have the opportunity to extend your mind in this way depends on kind of where you were born, what situation in society you were born in. You may not be able to extend your mind in this way because you just don't have the experience in your life of doing so and being stimulated to do so. And I found that a very interesting comment after all the time she spent in the book describing all the other ways your mind can be extended. And so that's a particular interest of mine. And so I just picked up on it and then attempted to expand it a bit with a few other things that happened to come my way, particularly the Time article that was just yesterday, I believe, or the day before, which talks about, let me see, the middle class families are treading water for decades, weighed down by stalled income growth and rising prices. And we're particularly reading that in the news the last few days about inflation and rents jumping 30%, and people not being able to buy houses. And now we have interest rates going up because of the Federal Reserve and the overheating economy. So it's a rather unsatisfying situation for at least half the population. And I might venture that I think that might be part of the reason that Trump got so much response from the population. These kind of conditions are the kind that lead to revolutions.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I'm sort of reminded of sort of the period of time, and maybe this is in my head because I just produced a video yesterday about where I'm reacting to one of Knowing Better's a video of his from last year, where he sort of, and it's kind of a confused video because he sort of begins by talking about Ayn Rand and objectivism, and then he sort of goes on to talking about the 70s and all of these things that happened in the 70s, and I actually skipped over that part of the video rather than responding to it because I think that a lot of that stuff should be its own things, right? Because there's a lot that happens, but it sort of reminded me of, and what you're saying sort of also reminds me of the 70s, right? When we had kind of the bill coming due for the really the Democratic administration, the previous Democratic administration's policies of the Vietnam War and the war on poverty, right? And so they caused this situation, and then Carter comes in, and he's basically got kind of a technocratic solution, which is ineffective and leads to stagnation and inflation. And oh, hey, Chris, and then that sort of leads to this sort of generalized disgust with kind of the way things are, and I'm reminded of that actually, and the thing that I responded to actually in that, hey, new camera,
something works.
All right. So yeah, so I was sort of reminded. I was sort of reminded of that kind of the way that inflation and interest rates were high in the 80s, especially like when I started working. And my first job, I was in the mutual fund business, and we were we were crushing because rates were so high, and we could, and of course I was working for one of those idiot companies that was aligned with Michael Milken and selling junk bond funds. So,
Easy to laugh
yeah.
about when you didn't go to jail for it.
I didn't go to jail for it. I got out in time. I got out before the fund for income kind of went into net redemption and started, doing the sort of, I think it ended up as kind of a Ponzi scheme where it was actually paying its dividends out of assets in order to kind of keep afloat towards the end. But I was out of it by then. Hopefully my clients were too. I'm sure they sent somebody to see my clients and try to talk them into sticking with it. But in any case, yeah, I think there's hey, Justin.
And now you're doing God's work, teaching.
Somebody's work. But I was a big fan.
So did you get sentenced to jail or not? That's the question.
I did not. I actually escaped.
As in teaching is the,
Oh, is that the sentence? Yeah. Ah, I see. I think I sort of laundered my karma in high tech for 15 years or 20 years. So maybe that saved me. But
the question is, are you investing now, and what should we do?
Yeah, I'm kind of all in on Tesla, but that's another story. Hello, buddy. Where's your little chickie? We've been playing fetch.
Twitter stock?
What's that?
You're not buying Twitter stock?
I have. I'm actually not really in the market on an active basis. For a couple of years there, after I retired from high tech, I sort of day traded. And that, I guess, I did all right for a while, but that didn't, then you always you always get too big of a head and you make a couple of mistakes and then it all goes to crap and you have to get a job again. So that was, so going, finishing my PhD and getting a job in academia was my decision to kind of go back to work.
So I'm curious then, what was your note-taking regimen during the PhD? Was there one, or you just all kept it?
It was Tinderbox and Scrivener. I was really trying, and I was actually in. I was in communication with what's his name at Eastgate a couple of times.
Mark.
Yeah, Mark, and talking about ways to make it, because I thought that I really was struggling with Tinderbox. I thought that although I actually had some coding experience, I thought it was way too the learning curve was way too steep and it was way too tweaky. Although there are, I guess there are people, and it was kind of funny because the first actual exposure to Zettelkasten that I had was, what's her name? Beck Tench, talking about Zettelkasten in the Tinderbox context. And I had huge things where I had, actually transcribed, thousands of 19th century letters that I was using as the basis of this. Excuse me, a little puppy dog wants to come in and see the cats.
This microphones. Is that better?
I can hear you.
Okay. I mean, somebody said they could hear me before, but it was muffled, and then I realized I'm using a $5 microphone instead of the $200 microphone off to the side.
Okay, well, you're definitely clearer now.
It's been a while since I've done it, but I think Mark is still doing, it's either weekly or monthly little meetups for Tinderbox.
Oh, wow.
And when I joined, I was by far the youngest person there. It was, primarily like academics in their 60s and over.
Yeah.
But there were like 20, 30 people who showed up to talk about Tinderbox on a regular basis. How can we improve it? How can we use it better? It was almost the same kind of religious feeling that some of the Rome groups have had, but just with a vastly older skewing audience who'd been doing this for a lot longer.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that both the fact that they're so old, they were our age or much younger, I'm sure, when they started using it 20 years ago.
Right.
But it was interesting to see that as both a culture that's still heavily into that. And it makes me wonder kind of, 200-300 years ago, did groups of people get together with their slips and their boxes of information and data and, swap their excerpts like trading cards?
Oh, Justin, nice. All right.
So apparently at some time I had this transcription and writing it in my own words thing figured out, but forgot about it in the intervening 15 years.
Yeah, I had put these things, I had put each of these, and the difficulty with Tinderbox for me, and I do remember, they had published a bunch of case studies of, like municipal governments and things who were doing big projects, and so it did seem like they were, I don't know, in my mind, to some extent, they were kind of a solution searching for a problem to solve, and they had this capability to put things in containers, which seemed to be what worked for it. I played around with Storyscape as well, because I was really fascinated, like all the way back to the days of HyperCard, right? I had fallen in love with HyperCard, and then when they started phasing it out, I was very sad, and I thought, there's got to be a way to do this type of thing, and to do this, type of connected branching paths sort of storytelling. And I thought for a while that Storyscape might be that thing, but it once again seemed to me like it was, it's a block, or it's a page, and then it has some navigation capabilities, at the bottom. You read the page, and then you decide what you want to do. Do you want to follow this character? Do you want to follow that character? Do you want them, to do this or that? Sort of almost in a kind of a role-playing game sort of way, but it didn't seem. But it still seemed very flat.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I have trouble with. Doing this, the affordances of doing it in digital, when it comes down to the creative problem solving part, when you've got all these excerpts and all these notes, what space are you rearranging them in a digital space? And is that the best way to go? Can you visualize it and see it the best way? Or, and I think I've said before, do a search and find a chunk of excerpts in my system. I'm going to export that to index cards on a printer, and then I can move things around in 3D space, and then make the decisions of, because you've got multiple links from one card to multiple other cards, and those multiple cards to others. But then when you're writing, part of your decision and choice is to narrow down those links into one linear column. And then once you've got that, that's the thing you've written.
Yeah.
But you still then don't want to lose all the other links. But most computer programs are horrific at actually doing that kind of visual. I'm going to readjust this bit of business here.
Mhm.
And index cards are incredibly good at it.
Yeah, I would also kind of second that there's like a huge amount of potential for distraction in the digital space with other apps popping up or just like colorful text that moves in the background. And it's just, you lose all that, or rather you throw all that away when you move to index cards in the physical world. You just have your table and your cards and there's nothing to interrupt you. Sorry, Tim, I jumped in front of you there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that does seem, and there is an arbitrariness, going back to what Chris is saying about the thing that you create out of that, right? So when I took all my, I had sort of made digital cards for each of these letters, right? And I put I didn't put the whole letter on there, but I put the things that I thought I was going to use, and then I used them. But then there was still this archive of these other hundreds of letters that I hadn't used. Tim, go ahead. You want to throw something in?
Yeah, I was thinking the one thing before we go into this, you deserve a big thank you for your neo-slavery video. I think excellent stuff.
Thank you.
I knew very little of it, and I was although it wasn't you that picked it up. I mean, obviously the guy you're critiquing had picked it up, but I thought the September 1942 date was spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the closest I've got to that from the British point of view is it's only like 5 years ago that the British taxpayer finished paying the debt that we as a government took on to pay off the slave owners when we abolished slavery from the empire.
Wow.
So it's 2015, 2016, something like that.
Wow. From 1833, is that when?
The government took out a loan. Of course, we didn't pay the slaves anything. We paid the owners for the slaves.
Right.
Right. So again, there's no 40 acres and a mule equivalent. It's
right.
Please, Mr. Jefferson, please take this 1,000 guilders or 1,000 guineas for your 52 slaves or whatever,
Right. Right.
Anyway, back to this topic. I think Chris has picked it up there, is that when we write something, what we actually write ultimately, at least at a card level, is a linear thing.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly with the Rome, the Obsidian, the log sig type people, who suddenly become in absolute awe of their mind map populating. And you see, I mean, Milo's a classic one. He's had whole, albeit short videos of, this is what happens when I load my 3,500 cards, or 3.5, and you get this properly little coloured up little diagram. And I'm going, yeah, okay. I'm a systems engineer. I do diagrams to make sure I can understand how it's supposed to work, how it does work, and does it actually do the two things actually match, amongst other things. And I know, because I draw them, you can't cope with much more than 50 nodes. You just can't hold those worries. And I know, therefore, if I've got a system that's bigger than that, I always find a way of making some sort of sensible subdivision such that there's 50 nodes on a piece of paper, and then there's a big link off to the left or the right or both even. Previous bit and subsequent bit, or whatever the natural break is, because there always is a break. And I then think of a few biochemistry colleagues and their mechanism for being able to remember some of the more tortuous biochemical cycles is they learn a song. They literally make it into a song because songs are easier to remember. And that comes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, is how did they do it before? Before they had reading and writing. It was rhetoric, it was song, it was dance. Although I don't particularly. It's why things.
I've missed you. I'm losing you there. It's why what?
It's like a thing, but at the gathering level, things get out of hand far too quickly, and you can lose context. Then when you try and get back into the creative mode or the analysis, you've got to start dropping stuff off simply because it's just too much. Anyway.
Yeah. No, so, I think that's important, right? There is kind of a road not taken element to the whole idea of choosing and deciding what's in the story and what's not in the story, what's relevant to the discussion and what's not. And we actually have, several times over the past several weeks, we've criticized people for indulging themselves in bringing something in that wasn't really germane, right? Or that wasn't really kind of on topic, right? That was a little bit of a digression, and suggested that, maybe that was because it was in it was in their stack of cards or their Zettelkasten, and they just were in love with it, right? And there's always, and people, teaching writers always say that, you have to kill your babies, and you have to know what to drop out. I really like, and I kind of do like that metaphor, and maybe it is from the Frost poem, of there being a forest of the Zettelkasten being, or the system, whatever it is, being a forest, and then the essay or the article or the novel or the monograph, is a path through the forest, but it touches some of the trees along the way, right? But not all of them, right? And it's an arbitrary path, right? It may be a well-worn path or it may be a brand new one, but in any case, it's one of many possible ways of getting through the woods that maybe isn't as privileged as it might seem to be, because it seems inevitable, right? Once you do it.
Where was it you saw that analogy, Dan?
Well, I made that one up.
You made it up? Okay. I thought you said something about frost, and I thought that.
Well, I think it reminds me of the Frost poem, of the road not taken, right? Two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and
because it's certainly come up. It's certainly come up elsewhere. Off the top of my head, I can't remember where.
Well, it's one of the driving forces behind this space that's loosely called the digital garden, which kind of comes out of Eastgate and their technology. And he, in fact, I think made one of his early websites is a website that kind of tells a story that's a bunch of pages loosely linked, and you can choose which way to go walk through his garden and which items to look at and focus on. And there's only so many things there, so you can see them all, and they're all interlinked in different ways, but you get to choose the path you walk through that garden.
Right. So and it's kind of the Marquez story, right, too. So so there are a lot of antecedents. But I think, and I noticed you on Twitter, you posted, you linked or you promoted somebody's digital garden yesterday or today, Chris. And I followed that link, and it turns out the guy used to work for the Foundation for Economic Education, which is also a little bit of synchronicity. The thing that I was responding to yesterday from Knowing Better was his sort of takedown of Ayn Rand and objectivism, and he went off onto this huge tangent about the 70s and the 80s, which Pat and I were talking about when you guys arrived, and I went to FEE. I got a fellowship to go to FEE when it was in Irvington, when Leonard Reed was still alive. So it just sort of blew my mind that this guy had been, I assume he had worked for them in Texas more recently, but I thought that was kind of interesting, because my students always think that I'm a lefty, right? They always think that I'm some kind of Marxist, because of kind of the decolonizing stuff that I talk about a lot of the time. But I was such an enthusiast after, when between my freshman and sophomore years at UMass, I read Atlas Shrugged. So, and that blew up my brain for several years.
Wait, you're saying in a former life you were a libertarian?
Yeah, well, I was an objectivist. I went to the Foundation for Economic Education, and I argued with them, saying that no, it wasn't necessary to have, because they were very sort of on the edge of kind of conservative religion, and so I had this huge fight with them about whether or not you needed to be religious in order to have morality. And I had got that initially, I think, probably from Ayn Rand, although later on I sort of turned it into a more generalized interest in sort of secular radicals. I don't like Marx for other reasons. I don't like Marx because Marx didn't like Bradlaugh in London in the 1870s.
I like how you really hold on to a grudge.
I do.
My grudges go back to the 1870s.
Yeah, and it wasn't even me. I'm offended on behalf of Bradlaugh. Yeah, one thing that I really liked in terms of in the context of this conversation about branching paths is on 147 of the Blair book. She's got this, and it says sideways. It says a draft of a branching diagram concerning politics in the Zwinger manuscripts, and it's this very busy thing that I thought was interesting, because I am kind of interested in this particular chapter, although I haven't given it as much time as I should yet, on sort of the things that you were talking about, the how we choose. Wait a minute, what's going on? Finding the tab. I'm not getting the sandwich reference, Justin.
Oh, that's like an old joke about old people who get up to do something and then discover themselves in the kitchen, or oh, I guess I'm in the kitchen because I was hungry. I'll make a sandwich, and they don't ever. Okay. I think it's a comic I saw 30 years ago.
Okay.
That's a very oblique attempt at humor, which I'm bad at. So there you go.
I don't have an actual note for it, but there is a psychology phenomenon that's been studied that when you walk through a doorway or a door frame, it resets the internal context of your mind. And so the things you were thinking about before you walked through the door, when you find yourself in this new context, you have left behind the old context and you forget all those things. So when you leave one room and go to another to do something, you should either write it down or think about it both before and immediately after you go through the door, so you don't forget. I had the issue this morning, just before we started. I'll go, oh, where did I leave my glasses? I know I had them in the bedroom 3 rooms ago, and I, had to retrace my entire steps through the house to figure out where I put them.
Yeah, why open plan office is working. Yeah,
I
also
wonder-
probably why.
Sorry, I wonder if the doorway thing, I heard that also. I wonder if that is connected to the like, well, maybe it's not, but all the different apps and tabs and stuff. Like when you go to like leave Obsidian to go search for that book you wanted to find and forget on the way, because you go to the browser and it's got something else that's interesting. That
Mhm.
could be related. I don't know. Anyway, I hate that.
Yeah. Also, probably, maybe also, I mean, if you're changing your mind state as you pass through a doorway, that may explain why, there are mezuzahs on the door posts of, traditional.
But in terms of the distraction thing, or the interruptions, it's a bit like saying, let me write a War and Peace size novel in Notepad and never go near a copy of Word for Windows, because I just don't want to worry about which bit's italic, which bit's bold, which bit's bulleted, which bit's not. And it's one of the reasons why, although I probably used Scrivener for like 2-3 years, as nice as it was, and as it certainly matched the way I liked to be able to work, in terms of I can work at any part of the book if I've outlined the chapters or the proposed chapters and all the rest of it, and given the chapter a card, and then done each of the scenes as a card, and then snowballed into the beats within the story into the card. And the next thing you know is you've virtually got the book. Gingo app does very much the same, but I keep going back to some respects, keep going back to even Notepad and say, I've got no buttons. I've got like 6 commands hidden behind 2 menus. And I don't even have to worry about, oh shit, did I put on the US spell checker, or did I put the UK one on? I can spell colour how I like,
Yeah.
And for the land of the free, I can't believe that you just deleted so many U's. Eyes, I might. Anyway, so that's one of the things I quite like about Obsidian is that if you use it out of the box, there's like 5 bits, 6 bits,
Mhm.
and you because it's effectively a glorified version of hypertext. What's bold and italic just gets a character in the front, or character in front, character at the back, and it doesn't change it on the screen until you say so. And you don't. And I can't recall ever flipping between the workspace deck, as it were,
And the reader?
to the preview deck, because why do I want to print preview? I ain't going to print it. I haven't physically printed anything for like 6 years now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting too, because as I've been playing around with creating ebooks in the last couple of years, I've also, found myself in a position where, and actually I sort of, who was it? There's a Canadian OER group that I told them I wanted to, their name will come to me in a minute. I told them that I wanted to write an ebook. I was already writing an ebook in Pressbooks, but I said, they had, I think, the EDU version of Pressbooks that I wanted to play with the H5P, and they wanted me to basically accept a whole sort of UDL superstructure, that I would kind of sign on to and promise to create my content in this way that had this, that used this universal design language, or universal design for learning, I guess they call it now. And it was like, it was like a different thing, right? It was like, so is the content, are the actual thoughts important, or is this a template that, that is primary, and the actual ideas are secondary? And does that have something to, does that change the way this thing will ultimately look and what it will ultimately be, right? Because it's different, and I've sort of looked at a bunch of different textbooks as I've been thinking about, the way that I'm gonna teach courses. And textbooks have these, they have these conventions, these things that they use, these sidebars that they use, a particular type of sidebar for a particular thing, and then they have, they have learning objectives, they have, sort of interactive things along the way, they have all of these kind of elements. And how much of that gets in the way of the content, and how much of that, and how much, and sort of by fitting the content to that structure, I think there's a point at which it becomes sort of detrimental to the user experience, especially for college students, but maybe for other types of readers as well.
Or it's detrimental for the person who's creating it, because that happens quite a bit in the journal article space. Especially if you're in kind of the math, physics, chemistry, and tech space, every journal has its own LaTeX template that they want you to use. So you spend a day or two taking this thing you've written and killed yourself over for years or months or however long, and you waste a day just reformatting it so you could submit it to a journal in whatever their format is, rather than, the idea of simple hypertext being divorced from the markup, and the fact that you can have, the HTML and the content here and the CSS that's the theming layer over here. And then with the flip of a button, you could change CSS the way you would change clothes,
Right.
pretty quickly and easily. But I've wondered that too, because I've seen, and it's incredibly rare, I don't think I've ever seen an actual copy or held one in my hands, but it used to be reasonably common that you could go out and buy or find an interleaved copy, or people made their own interleaved copies of books. And probably the only ones I've seen in modern times are interleaved copies of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, so if you've never seen it, it's literally, you would take a copy of the Bible, and then in between every page, you would stick a blank page, with the intent that now you have way more margin space to write on and create notes physically in the book you're using.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an awesome idea. And that I've seen copies of interleaved Bibles with massive amounts of, commentary and annotation in them. But it shouldn't be that hard for me to go to Amazon and say, I want to buy a copy of Ann Blair's book, but I want one that's interleaved, and I can choose how big or small my book is in terms of, maybe I want a presentation size copy of Blair's book, but I want it interleaved, and I even want the margins on each of the pages to be, 2 inches, so that as I'm reading it, I can draw in it, write in it, create my own notes, do whatever I want, because the text is just the text. And there's a format, and even to pull it on topic to where she's talking, there may be finding devices or bits and pieces of, yes, I want to say, I found this thing on page 47 of the canonical version, but that should be even easy to do in a digital age where print on demand is, a dime a dozen. And yet somehow we don't have any of those affordances. And it really drives me bonkers, because I can go do that myself,
Mhm.
and download a digital copy of the book and relay it and reformat it. And then I could send it off to a printer or even the local Kinko's, and for a few, $10, $20, have my
Right.
own custom copy.
Mhm.
But there's almost no manufacturer making that easy. And that, to me, that's like an easy thing for Amazon to fall off the turnip truck with,
Yeah.
and really,
Yeah.
really make difficulty for other publishers.
Yeah, I think the open textbook library was playing around with that. I think COVID got in the way, but they invited me a couple of years ago, and I actually went down physically and with some other people. I think from not just Minnesota, but other national institutions. We got involved with a guy by the name of Adam, who works or owns Editoria and the Cocoa Foundation, and they were kind of creating this new. They were going to create this new publishing platform for the Open Textbook Network that would have a lot of those types of capabilities, different types of formats that could go around kind of chunks of content that also could be assembled into things by the users, right? Where, and part of that had to do with the idea of in open education, a big element is remixing, right? So of the 5 R's, remixing is maybe the most important one that people are supposed to be allowed to kind of go in and and using Creative Commons licensing, basically take things and take from things with appropriate citation and then turn them into the thing that they want. Go ahead, Justin.
I think like tying this theme back to where you started with like all these different formats and tools and accessories that textbooks like to stick into them. I think if the student or the learner or whatever you want to call them, depending on context, like doesn't approach it with the frame of mind that they need to be a very active participant in deciding how they're going to get what they want out of the material. Like it's so easy to just be like, oh, I'm supposed to use this learning bubble and then read the sidebar and then I've done it and I'm done and now I've learned it. Except because you haven't converted it into the thing that you need, you haven't turned that knowledge into the format that your brain wants. Like you haven't learned it. You've just gone through the motions in like a zombie state, and it's kind of useless. So all those different things that they like to put on textbook these days, I think actually kind of make it harder for the student to understand what their role is in this. And like you were saying, Chris, with like, if we could remix this book so we can have all this like huge margin space to write on, because I'm currently thinking I want to go back to physical books because I didn't engage really well with the digital copies of the books we're doing in this book club. And the margins on this one book I'm reading right now are like half an inch wide. I'm like, I mean, like my handwriting's not big, but like, how do I fit what I want into this tiny little space? But that is like, you have taken it and like, this is what I want. I'm going to customize it for me with these interleaved pages in a way that I can use. Like that's you taking an active role in the materials you want to learn. And it would be custom to every single person, but like they have to decide that and do it for them. I don't know. I'm okay.
I think that was one of the places that I actually had that original thought that, oh, I totally, and now that I know that this could be a potentiality, it drives me bonkers that it's as hard as it is. But the original driving forces, I think I saw a copy of an Interleaved Bible while I was reading. There's a book called Annotations by Remy Kalir and Antero Garcia that's published by the MIT Press, and it came out in the last 2 years, I think.
Sure.
But it's part of a series for the MIT Press, so it's in the series is all in paperback, and they're small, nice size. It's not even a 6x9. I think it's a 5 3/4 by 8 and change. But the book is called Annotations, and the margins in this book are quarter of an inch at best. I'm like, who the hell is the series editor that let this slide? Like even with my smallest, tiniest writing, it's still, I can't interlineate, annotations or really write much in the margins. And I'm like, it's, so I went and got the electronic version so that I could fill the margins all the way up. But I was like, this is such a lost opportunity.
Yeah. But it perceives itself as a piece of art, right? I mean, it's like I bought my son a copy of Be Here Now, right? And the I think it's like 9x9, right? And it's got all of the the text going around in circles or in squares, but it just all of that kind of creative stuff that Ram Dass did in that book, but it leaves no margins, right? There's no invitation to participate, right? You're viewing their cultural production. Go ahead, Justin.
Like the two hacks I have, but it doesn't feel as good at being able to write in the margins or write on the book, because you can lose it. It's like, one is Post-its. Those fatten up your book and make it like you start wrecking the binding if you really get into it. Like when I read Thinking Fast and Slow, I had like a Post-it on every page, basically both sides, doubled the thickness of the book. And that's a slight exaggeration. But for another one is to just like use footnotes. So like you number your note and then keep your notes in like a companion book, but like then you have to keep them together, and I'm pretty good at that, but not perfect, so I lose those. But the digital one, I really wrote a lot of notes in the Dawn of Everything book in the digital copy, and I was like, oh cool, this is working. But then for like Blair and for Murphy Paul, I don't know, I just really didn't write many digital notes, and I was like, why? So I don't know, still trying to figure that out.
Yeah,
I think I'm having the opposite issue where I want to excerpt everything in Blair. And
your highlights are fat, yeah.
And it's but in part two, my highlights are big and fat because I try to specifically excerpt as much context as I can without leaving something off to make the point I want to make, but with the expectation that when I excerpt it and have it in Obsidian or wherever it's going to live, I'll be able to more easily go back and look at the bulk of the context that I originally had without needing to go back and find the original text. Although even doing that now is far easier because of the way I store everything digitally. I can, with 2 clicks, I can be back in the original PDF or EPUB document and look at the whole thing.
Right.
But even then, it's still a pain in the neck. But but
it's like, and it also takes you through that door where you're going to think about something else.
Yeah. But I also have taken to, and probably for the first time in ages, a lot of the stuff I'm highlighting some of the basic fact things that I want to keep, and I'm maybe adding a few tags, but I'm saving them privately. And I have, and I do it because I know what patterns they're using, but it drives me bonkers to see the student's textbook where every sentence in the whole damn book is highlighted. And that drives me bonkers because it wasn't all that important. And they weren't keeping it, they weren't memorizing it, they weren't excerpting it and having it somewhere else, but that's the practice I'm using. So I can have this horrifically over highlighted book with 8 million notes, but my intention is, because this is an area of research that I'm delving into fairly heavily, I'm going to be able to actually reuse all this stuff. But I also don't have the time to, from a literature notes perspective, put it all into my own words versus something like, the Graeber and Wengrow there might be one or two tidbits here and there every 4 or 5 pages, or I might write a note on an overall chapter. Here's the arc of where this chapter went, versus, oh, this, all 10 sentences in this paragraph are interesting to me in and of themselves, and I can totally foresee myself reusing them. But in this particular book, I started saving a lot of this stuff and writing some of my notes and keeping them private so that I could come back and work on them and then make them public later on. And it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think that yeah, you're right. I actually had to buy the guy that I was partnered with actually wanted to use a real textbook. And so I had to buy a used copy of this textbook, and it came, for $90, it came heavily highlighted, and it just drives me crazy. But I think that in your case, Chris, it strikes me that this over highlighting that you're doing here, if you call it that, is probably an indication that you're closer to output. Right, because you're looking at this, and this is stuff that is like right in your bailiwick, and so it makes complete sense. I mean, I actually probably had the opposite experience. There was more stuff that I was pulling out of Grayburg Wengrow, because it's like, oh, I can use this next semester in this unit of my my prehistory thing, and so yeah, I think that is when it's working. I think that is kind of cool.
I will say too, one of my other favorite affordances, and it's also makes this incredibly slow reading, is I'll make a highlight and write a note, and then I'll add a few tags to it and a hypothesis. And then when I hit publish, I'm like, as I'm writing the tag, it will autofill with the name of some really obscure 14th century scholar who I don't recognize or remember, but it autofilled, which means I've used it before. So then I now have to go look at I click on it, and I can go look at the document and the note that I made somewhere else.
Right.
And there was, I think, at least one case where I had made notes of some total rando, not only for the general public, but even for me in thinking in the space. And I'm like, oh, I've written this guy's name down 4 times now in 4 different sources, and none of them have a primary source that's in common. So I'm like, okay, now my reading list is just, expanded dramatically, because now I have to go read these 4 sources in greater depth to figure out who was this guy and why was he so famous for his time, but we totally have lost him. There's no Wikipedia page about this guy at all, and and then 3 hours later I go back to that sentence that I was originally working on, and I have to recontextualize the whole thing to figure out, okay, where were we and where are we going again.
So I hear like a huge amount of expansion, like a lot of capture, but like I was gonna interject earlier about like the idea of highlighting or underlining or commenting in your physical book, and then putting it aside for a month, coming back to it, and then distilling those out to the and fewer things that you actually feel like you need to keep because they have a longer term resonance. But this like expansion and capture and continue to capture and more, like you must have to reduce that at some point. What does that look like, Chris? Like you've got this, sounds like massive, I mean, just based on your Bafo Sako website, like you have this massive amount of material, very impressive, but like what direction does it go after that?
Well, it's the question of distilling. You find all these interesting things, and then you can pick up a thread, or there's times where I'll start writing a note in a margin, and I'll write half a journal article right there because I'm motivated and I'm interested in the thing at the time. So those will turn into, and usually I'll turn them into a blog post or something else. So it's almost instantaneous output. But I can do that also by going in and finding the notes that I know they're linked to and drop a few paragraphs in, or quite often in conversations, after you've been doing it for a while, it's a whole lot easier when you see somebody will ask a question about a topic and I'll be like, oh, I know I have that answer. But not only do I have that answer, but I've written the whole thing out. So I can literally go into my notebook, excerpt that paragraph that I've already written and say, here. So it's, and I, even in, there's a few other people I know who do these types of practices, and I've seen them and it's almost become a habit. There's Bill Seitz is an example, and he's got a really long dedicated wiki he's been using probably for 20 years. And he can sit in a conversation like this, and every 3 minutes he'll drop a link into the chat of, here's my wiki page for that topic that's got not only the 3 answers we're all talking about, but links to 5 other things if you want to delve deeper. And it's a really fascinating practice, but I only know 3 or 4 people who can actively do that. But you can only do it because you've been doing this for a while.
Right. Well, and it is probably analogous to, you know, what Aaron's described as Luhmann's ability to basically just take these things, you know, take these building blocks and assemble them very quickly into an article, right? Because you've done all of that pre-work. Right? For students, one of the things that strikes me is that that motivation. I think, Justin, you were kind of mentioning that, and Chris too. You know, that you know, how do we, you know, okay, I read the thing, I did the thing, and boom, okay, check that off. I've learned it, but you haven't learned it, and so that's why I've become sort of fascinated at the same time. As I've become fascinated with sort of format agnosticism, I've also become fascinated with retrieval practice, right? And with ways of, you know, kind of getting students to, and it's not exactly, and I want to say, I want to say, but I want to also avoid saying, tricking students into remembering stuff. And you know, and understanding stuff and linking stuff in their heads. Oh yeah, thanks, Chris. I'll look into that too. That looks cool. So I think that is, you know, and I think that in education, I think that's an interesting moment, right? Because this idea that, you know, and we've been struggling with it through this whole COVID crisis. This question of, you know, what do we do about the learning outcomes that we had traditionally, you know, built tests and exams and term papers and things around, and are they the best way to go in the future? So I think that's.
I don't see many people writing about it in modern education contexts, and probably the closest is Andy Matuszak, who used to work for Khan Academy. Mm-hmm. And he has a nice long article about kind of mnemonic mediums and how do you teach in a way that kind of builds the memory piece into the lesson so that the student doesn't have to sit down and physically memorize, you know, what happened on July 4th, 1776. But the way you talk about it literally embeds 1776 into their memory so deeply at the time you taught it that it becomes nearly impossible to forget it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was watching last night, there's a documentary from, I think, 2017 called The Perfect Bid. And it's about a guy who was like really taken with The Price is Right in his youth. So he would sit and keep track and keep lists of every item that ever came up for bid and what the right answer was. And it turned out they very regularly reused the same items over and over and over. And he had this massive list, and he built his own custom piece of software to do spaced repetition to quiz himself on these items. And then he started going to visit the show And so the guy did like, 30 episode tapings of the show in person. And while he's there, he's been practicing this stuff. So he's feeding answers to the people as they're there. And some of them are using what he's saying, or they realize, oh, this guy's gotten it right like 9 times out of 10. So they use that to win more on the show. And then at least once he got on the show himself and did fairly well, but it was the statistical anomalies of both the products and the things that happened that he didn't end up winning massive prizes. But there was an instance a year into Drew Carey's tenure on the show after Bob Barker retired, that a guy who was sitting 2 people away from him in the audience, and I think understood what was going on, what this guy's capabilities were. So he started using them, and in a really lucky fashion made it all the way through to the very end. And then at the very end of the show, it happens that the multiple prizes that were in his big package at the end were things this guy knew to the dollar the value of, and they had appeared weeks before. And so he literally shouted out the number, flashed it, and the guy's wife was feeding him the number as well. So the guy used that number and literally hit it right on the head without going over. And as a result, won both prize packages in the thing. And the show thought, hey, this is somebody's cheating, somebody's screwing with us. And they thought it was going to be, the $60,000 question scenario. And it turns out it was just a guy who paid a lot of attention and literally memorized all the material. Although in the documentary, at least at one point, he indicated there was one visual mnemonic thing he used for remembering one product. And I have to imagine that happened for more than one, but because he's got lists of thousands of items, he's memorizing exact, 3 and 4 digit numbers for. So
extreme case of card counting.
Yeah. But now, now the show as a result varies the products a whole lot more. Or if there's a car, they change the features and the options on it. Whereas, 10, 20 years ago, it was the same car with the same package. And if you saw it once, you knew had a pretty good chance of getting it every time.
No. That's kind of ironic that it's that the thing that does them in is that someone actually takes them seriously.
Yeah. Well, there was at least one point that they pulled up footage for. He was on an episode and was feeding numbers to people, and Bob Barker called him out in the audience like 8 times. Like by the end of this episode, Bob Barker was friends with this guy. Wow. Like, we know who you are. And he's like, wow, the guy's been right more often than not. Although there was one girl that there was some weird flirtation going on, and the girl knew he was there and had fed her one right number, but then she totally kind of blew him off and screwed up, the 3 other numbers he gave her, and so she lost.
Wow. Yeah, it's so going back to this text and these ways that people have organized, right? This chapter that we kind of ran away from and then sort of came back to, right, was the one on reference and finding. So is there more that we want to talk about in that sort of connects to this conversation that we're having? Well, I can't quite hear you, Tim.
I didn't say a word.
Now I can, yeah.
Might have been background noise.
Okay.
Yeah. I know one of my favorite finding devices, and I almost kind of use hypothesis this way now sometimes, especially when I come back to a book like Blair. There used to be a bookmark type slip that would be, sewn into the binding of the book that would flip over, and you'll see them usually in diaries now. It's like the old ribbons that you use, and you can remark your pages, but they had these little circular dials on them with a little spinner, so you could spin it and create an indicator of which line or even which word you were on, so that you could, when you were done reading, you could put the ribbon in the book and know exactly to the word where you had left off, which is interesting. And I find in using hypothesis, and particularly in this book where I'm highlighting as much as I am, or if I'm skipping around in certain sections, I can see what I've read and what I haven't read. But I can go and click at the top and say, show me the newest highlight or annotation, and that's where I finished for that particular day, and then I'll know. So I'm kind of using one of those really old, and I'm pretty sure those date to medieval contexts because they were in old manuscripts before printing. I'll have to look and see there's a few academics who've written histories and collected these things. The tough part is a lot of them, apparently the little circle spinner fell off the ribbon or the piece of paper that was put in there as a marker. So they're found on shelves or in boxes, and nobody knows which books necessarily they came from.
You've come full circle now. You're just highlighting every single sentence again, and now that's how you know where you got to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often go back to hypothesis and just go to my last highlight and figure, well, if I didn't highlight anything past there, then either I can skim through it very quickly, or it was because that's where I actually stopped paying attention, and I should really give it some more attention, depending on, and that depends, I suppose, on how I feel about the thing that I'm reading.
Well, I'll go back to your question from the beginning, or just before we started, Dan. Should we continue on? And I won't feel insulted if we don't. I love this, and this is kind of my area, and I can nerd on this stuff for the next 6 months. But it's also because I'm as interested in it, even my reading pace at doing it and trying to process the notes to be useful for the rest of the group is so slow. It's pitiful. But once you dwindle down to 3 or 4 or 5 people, although let's be honest, we're all the best in the whole group, right? No insult to the people who are going to watch this time shift.
We're going to watch this.
Hopefully, we're far enough into the very end of this. If you've made it this far, you're one of the gang, and you're probably thinking, God, you'll see this 2 years from now and think, God, I wish I had been there with them.
Yeah. Well, we have to make it. Yeah, we have to make it worth their while, because even at 1.5, this is a long.
But
video.
I'm going to keep reading it and keep excerpting, and most of my notes are public, so feel free to hop in and find that copy or the fingerprinted PDF or email me, and we'll figure it out. But we can always move on to another book, and
well, I'm okay to.
There's too much to read, so you can't ever stop.
Too much to know, too much to read. I'm okay with continuing. We've only got a couple more weeks to go with this text, and then I'm not, if there was something that there was an overwhelming desire to kind of get right to, then I guess I would feel more like, maybe this is something that, that there wasn't enough sort of generalized interest in to kind of keep people coming. It may just be that it's a difficult time of year. It's been a very it's been a very busy end of the semester for me, and it's now finally. That's a good suggestion, Pat. We could meet in a couple of weeks, and that would give us time to, spend an adequate amount of time on each of these chapters. It would take us, till the end of May to get through the book, but on the 14th,
actually, I also have a commitment on the 14th, but that's fine. Let's see. I have admitted to myself that I'm not seriously reading these two texts, and I really enjoy the conversations we're having on Saturday morning, and hope I'm bringing enough to the conversation to be worth my attendance. But I'm not reading enough to be bringing anything out of the books, because I didn't find them dense enough in practical things that I could take to my own practice. Fascinating and absolutely interesting, just not as usable as I was looking for. So,
and I think I'm at the other end of the spectrum where I'm at the other end of the spectrum where I'm too interested in them and spending too much time reading and excerpting, but then I don't have enough time to actually process the notes to say, here's 15 things we can talk about with respect to what's going on, which is tough. Although then the other question too is, what do we do next? I know, Dan, you had mentioned Tiago Forte's book is coming out in June, but that's a ways off.
That is a ways off.
I actually hopped into, I have a NetGalley account, and a friend of mine just started reading it. And it was like, I didn't think it was coming out for another month or so. And she's like, I have a NetGalley account. And so I've got an advanced reader's version. So
How is it?
She says it's fairly interesting so far. And I don't think she's as knee deep into this topic as we are. But I think she indicated there is a lot of marketing buzzword material for what these practices are, and he's just selling a version of how he's used it, or how he teaches courses on essentially the commonplace book method is really where he's coming from. But he's teaching it from a productivity standpoint.
Well, and that's where that's where I was kind of concerned about it being too much of a commercial for his technique. In a way similar. I mean, and kind of even, people who I think have interesting things to say, and sort of have things that I'm interested in hearing about, like even Tim Ferriss sometimes, it's sort of like, okay, that's just, this is just a synopsis of your latest book.
Yeah. Or they'll have something to say, but it's one thing to say, and they say it 57 different ways.
Yeah.
And after you've seen them appear on something twice, you're like, okay, until 10 years from now, I call it the Jewel syndrome, because Jewel spent a decade living out of the back of a van playing and composing her music. And after 10 years, she was able to come out with a brilliant first album that had 3 or 4 number one hits. So the record company loved her, but then the record company, in buying her first album, says, we have the option on your next 2 or 3 albums, and you need to have one come out every year or every 2 years at the worst.
Right.
And as a creator, how do you
got to spend 10 more years in the van.
You spent 10 years writing the first one with all these hits. So how do you do that again? The same effect, applies almost everywhere else. M. Night Shyamalan is another good example.
Yeah. Tracy Chapman. Yeah.
How do you do it? Unless you've got some massive amount of notes or material that you can draw on that you've been collecting over time. I think I've mentioned it before. Eminem has a very super loose commonplace book system that he just keeps slips of paper in a box in random order with no rhyme or reason. That he calls his method stacking ammo. which I think is hilarious.
It is well, and it's very contingent too, or sort of he could reach in and pull out anything. Yeah, I also wonder about Prince's vault, but and just doing something so with the record button pushed for so long that that there's something in there.
Even then, you got to be able to go back and delve into it, or re-listen to it to find those gems, or have written down the music, and that's a whole nother. How do you manage that collection, particularly in a digital era like this?
It kind of it's weird too, because some things just kind of blow my mind. Like my kids have just gotten really interested in Jacob Collier. The two kids that I still have at home are both musicians, and so I'm taking them down to the cities to a Jacob Collier. Their first concert, they want to go to a Jacob Collier concert. So I'm taking them down there. But Jacob Collier, I mean, he puts his production stuff up on YouTube, and they're like 2.5, 3 hours long. So these things are longer than like Joe Rogan podcasts. And and it's him in Pro Tools, playing around and mixing these songs that he releases. So there seems to be interest in that stuff, even if it kind of comes out in sort of a loosely formatted or even not particularly formatted kind of stream of consciousness way.
My experience with that is it's more genuine and more accessible than what Hollywood or the pro companies are putting out, which are just so commercialized. Kind of tying it back to what you were saying earlier, it's just like an advertisement for something else, and it's just so irritating. I'm so tired of that. So just to watch them like slow, kind of related to like the slow TV movement also, where it's just kind of something that's happening and unfolding, and it's like relaxed and real life. It's more interesting to have that on the TV than the latest episode of Law and Order or whatever.
Yeah. I wonder if kind of reality TV primed us for that in a way. It's kind of funny. I was last night I had YouTube on, and I think it was Ricky Gervais at Oxford in the Q&A after his Oxford talk, and he was talking about the Office and reality TV and all of that, and how absurd reality TV has become in recent years, and how scripted and artificial and all that. But yeah, I think that there is kind of an authenticity. There certainly are people who are better than other people at being in front of a camera and doing the stream of consciousness and having it come off as something that is not too painful to listen to, right? And
there are painful ones, and you just turn them off right away.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, some of the people that I like, I wonder, how many takes did that take, to get that, to get that video made.
Even on the Collier side, things like that to me are interesting, because usually the Pro Tools companies are selling you a dream as a customer. If you do this, or you buy these tools that, let's say we use your example of Prince. Prince used this guitar, Prince used this recording mixer. They're selling you the dream that you as a customer can have that too.
Yeah.
But almost no customer is going to put in the time and effort and energy that Prince did.
Right.
Much less are they going to have the natural talent or the lifetime, Itzhak Perlman experience, having given his life, to be able to use those tools in that way. So Collier becomes then an interesting example of, here's a pro who's able to use these tools incredibly well, who's really talented, and the watching him use them is another one of his talents that you would never have been able to see but
Mhm.
now there's a way to distribute that as a product. And it may be more interesting to watch him use them. If if you're a young student, you want to be him or make that kind of music, then you get the master class of being able to watch it.
Mhm.
But you can do that and have that experience and see how it works before you spend the $5,000 on the product itself,
Right.
which
But-
may have been a big reach.
Yeah, but think about the difference between like Dead Mouse did a master class, right?
Yeah.
And it was, it was kind of interesting, but it wasn't. I mean, it didn't teach you anything, right? Whereas, I watched, I didn't watch the whole thing. It was like 2.5 hours long. The Pro Tools workshop that I had clicked on, but he's talking about kind of using these envelopes on some particular sounds in the clip that I was, the 10 minutes or so that I was watching, and he's comparing this to side chaining, right? And it was like, holy crap! I mean, this is actually how you do it, right? And he was, and he was talking about, how this is different from side chaining, and it was, I hope he is. Hope is I'm sure his user count is at the point where he's massively monetizing that. But think about just all of the different ways, and that actually kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about that sort of format agnosticism of how is it these kind of chunks of information that are meaningful, right? How polished do they have to be? And what's the relationship between the format that you choose and the polish that you have to put on it, and and all of these things. I remember hearing, God, who was it? It might have even been like somebody like Jordan Peterson a couple of weeks or months ago, saying, why would I write another book when I can do I can do something immediate, on something like, I don't know if it was YouTube or where he was making this comment, but he was talking about the relative, reward versus effort that goes into sort of, publishing a monograph or publishing a popular book or publishing an article or putting something out there, that you can monetize in other ways. And monetization isn't the be all and end all, right? And all of that, but the idea of of finding an audience, communicating stuff that is important to you to other people.
Or what does your platform look like? So
Yeah.
in this setting here, I almost wish, I think we've even talked about it in the past. We wish we knew what Ann Blair's own excerpting and note-taking system looks like. And she has enough platform for me that I would sit and watch her read and take notes,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm curious to see what somebody who studied this heavily, what their system looks like, because surely she would be my Jacob Collier, so I could sit and watch her take notes all day.
Right.
And with the expectation that I can learn something from that and be better at it myself. But she doesn't have nearly enough of a platform, and it's such a niche area that, besides the 5 of us, who really is going to care enough? I know there's a slightly bigger group, but not much.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it did go through an academic press and not, and the Murphy Paul.
Well, I think you've mentioned the phrase, show us the receipts before.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious if academic presses, are willing to say, hey, we'll take this on some faith, although usually press editors have enough of a background in the area they're purchasing in, they probably don't need to, but it would be, hey, we'll buy that book, but show us your Zettelkasten first.
Yeah.
Let me pull a few cards out to see, do you have the expertise that you really say you do without especially if you're a junior scholar and you've never published anything before. What does that look like? Or does the size of your Zettelkasten for that particular area give a good indicator of, will your book be turned in on time? Or are you going to spend the next 4 years researching it heavily before you can actually produce it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then in that case, there's probably a critical mass that you don't want to go beyond, because then you've identified yourself as a collector, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have a student who got into grad school, partially, I think, on the basis of a process paper that she wrote about her thesis, where she did talk about the primary sources that she was finding, and the fact that she was using Obsidian, and that Obsidian had led her to see some connections between some things that she wouldn't otherwise have seen. And I think that her description of the research experience probably did her a lot of good in actually getting into grad school. So, there's a practical, I guess, a practical result of my forcing my student to use Obsidian. So Justin, what the audience, and that is kind of it's kind of weird, because I just taught modern world history for the last time possibly in a while, and we sort of end with climate change, but also filter bubbles and alternate facts, and sort of the world, the information world that we live in, and how that exacerbates the debate over climate and what to do about it and all that. And a lot of the students initially kind of leaned into sort of the negativity of that, of this loss of sort of consensus and everything. And so it occurred to me that I have to sort of remind them that the putative consensus that we had back in the age of consensus, right, when there were the three networks and Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America and all of that, was manufactured consent. And so it wasn't really that nobody disagreed on things. It was that that the business model of media at the time was seeking consensus, right? And it was seeking the largest single audience share, right? And so they weren't leaning into controversy and into division. I've always been obsessed with that kind of question that I guess that Neil Stephenson asked in Snow Crash, right? Like, why do languages tend to converge or diverge, right? And maybe it's an artificial question, but it was interesting to me anyway. But it's very hopeful, right, that we have all of these opportunities, I guess, is kind of the long way to coming around to that. What I realized I had to try to do was leave students with this idea that, for all of its flaws, right, this ability that we have is has so much more potential than the age of spoken words, or the age of print, or whatever.
I'll have to look it up and figure out what it was so I can actually listen to the whole thing. But I caught like 2 sentences on NPR this morning as I was making coffee and getting ready. But I've heard the phrase that the ultimate luxury good these days is the not even just the ability to control the narrative, but to own the conversation and force it. So you have the Steve Jobs, how can I use Apple to control what's going on and how people compute and what's happening in the world? Or Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook, and so he literally owns the conversation. Or this week, Elon Musk buys Twitter as a means of, this is how I'm going to exert influence and control. I'm going to sell off a massive share of Tesla so that I can make this purchase because it's worth more to me. I don't know if I got the you know, I think the quote was the luxury good is the ability to control reality in some sense. But I'll have to dig into that. But that seems like it's kind of related to that, you know.
See,
question and, you know, manufactured consent. Who's manufacturing what now, and how are they manufacturing it?
Yeah. See, I'm not. I guess I'm much less cynical about Elon than about some other people. Although, if he had an ulterior motive, my suspicion that it would be further down the line, that, you know, that maybe Twitter is an input device for Neuralink, right? That, you know, that maybe there is a longer, you know, a longer game that he's playing that has something to do with AI than that he wants to control the discourse right now. But, you know, maybe I'm wrong.
So as we come down to the last few minutes, what are we going to do?
Why don't we, well, we can't meet on the 14th. Anybody feel an overwhelming urge, aside from Chris, for doing these last 2 chapters of the Blair book?
No.
I'm not, you know, and I don't want to read too much into, you know, the fact that other people haven't been able to attend regularly, but I assume that that is also a suggestion that they're not in love with this time around.
The professor usually knows when he doesn't have the students. Go with your gut reaction there, Dan.
Well, I don't want to read too much into it because it's also my own sort of reaction to these 2 things, is that they were, you know, they weren't my choices, and I'm not feeling as energized about them as I was feeling about Dawn of Everything, for example, or as I might feel for, I don't know, something else that went in that sort of controversial direction. I'm thinking something like Debt or Bullshit Jobs or something like that. But, and I don't want this to be like the Graeber reading group either. But another one that I've started listening to, and it's short, is James Scott's 2 Cheers for Anarchism. But, you know, that's you know, maybe that's too of my own, you know, geeking out on anarchism. So I don't know exactly what to do. It doesn't seem like, if people wanted to do it, I would return in a couple, you know, maybe, I mean, I could come back next week, but it doesn't sound like anybody's super interested in doing next week. We can't do the following week. Should we just put a bullet in this one's head and say this one's over, and we'll start thinking about what we want to do next? I do like, I mean, Justin, I agree with you. I like just getting on Zoom and talking on Saturday mornings. And so for me today, this was fun. This was a successful outing. It doesn't, you know, it's not that related to the Blair book.
Yeah, we should finish it off. And if
Okay.
you want to continue on, you can find us in the margins, or, you know, I'm sure the vault will still be there. So.
Oh, the vault will definitely, yeah, the vault's not going anywhere. So what do we got going? Next week. Yeah, should we kind of return to Obsidian next week? Do we want to kind of go back to, you know, sort of talking about Obsidian and, you know, and really kind of, you know, the way we took notes? Add-ons might be a thing. We've sort of danced around that and never really kind of kind of addressed it directly. All right, why don't I put a, go ahead, what were you?
I was just gonna fill the pregnant pause with, yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Well, then why don't I I'll put a note in the community forum and say that we're gonna kind of not talk about the Blair book next week, but rather talk about Obsidian and add-ons, and so invite people to come back and talk about that and their process again, and then and then we'll skip a week, and maybe by the 21st we'll have kind of figured out where we're landing.
And maybe put it into people's heads, suggestions for other things,
Yeah.
weeks or months hence. I had a reminder popped up that Thomas Piketty's book, Brief History of Equality, just landed.
Oh,
So I gotta buy and get a copy of that.
yeah, I would.
But that may, if people are interested in something like that, especially as a follow-on to Graeber and Wingray.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if that is more, if that is a little bit less dense than Capital in the 21st Century, that might be helpful too.
I could go into those dense ones too, but
Okay, I probably could in the okay, Tim, start offering options. Yeah.
and
Yeah, okay.
Piketty is only 288 pages apparently. So
Okay, so maybe he sticks to one theme and one thought. I mean, there is something to be said for that, right? And that was the problem with Graeber and Wingro, was they bounced around a bit too much. Okay, I'll put that, and I'll put that note in Obsidian too, and people can respond. All righty, cool. Well, thanks. This was fun today. I appreciate you guys coming. I appreciate talking. So I enjoyed this.
thanks, Dan.
All right, see you guys.
All right. See you next week. Take care.